Thanks. That's Tom Sawyer's struggles, that he doesn't want to paint the fence, so he has to find a way to get someone else to do it. So it can be a short, it can be a very short story that has a struggle in it or has a problem of some kind. It can be a humorous story. It doesn't have to be this big epic adventure. And then most stories have a theme of some sort. What is the story about in general? Is it a love story? Is it a fish out of water story? Is it, you know, just kind of the general sense of what that story is about? Okay. We've got all of these ideas for possible stories about our lives rolling around in our head. So how do we go about choosing which stories are the most important to tell? We talked about this quite a bit last week, but I just want to go over that for those of you, especially who don't have the kit and haven't been through the first part of this process. There is definitely a method and an order of doing things that makes it much easier for you. And one thing that we have, we encourage everyone to do, all of our clients, and we use this ourselves when we are telling our own stories or ancestral stories, is to create a timeline. And the timeline can be, you can use the timelines that come with the kit. You can use just a big sheet of paper. You can use a notebook with, you know, a year or a date at the top of each page. You can write it on a roll of paper towels if you want to, whatever you're comfortable with. But a timeline is a place to capture all of these random ideas that come to you, random memories, random little mental snapshots that you want to remember and you might want to use in your history, maybe, maybe not, or maybe you'll use them for another story if you don't use them for this story, but you still want to capture everything and give it a chronological context and sort of a catch-all to put things in as they come to you. Because if you don't write them down right away, if you don't jot just a couple of notes about something that you remember while you're thinking of it, you'll probably forget about it again. So this is a great way to capture these ideas as they come to you. You don't have to worry about saying, you know, making a decision while you're creating your timeline about, oh, would this make a good story or not? Just, you know, jot down a few words to remind you of something that you might want to add to a story later. So you're going to spend some time capturing this information on a timeline. And that doesn't mean, just because the timeline is chronological, doesn't necessarily mean that your story is going to be written in a chronological fashion. You can have a completely different structure for your story, but it will make it easy, just make it easier for you to capture these things in a way that will make some sense. Okay, and then after you have a timeline that's pretty well fleshed out, you've got a lot of things on there. You know, the timeline is never complete. There's never a point where you say, okay, I'm finished with the timeline. I have every important thing I've ever done in my life is on this timeline. You won't ever get to that point, really. And you can continue to jot things down that you might want to use in a different project even after you've finished your book. But the next step, once you have a timeline that you feel like you have a lot of material to work with and you're ready to begin, the next step is to perform what we call story triage, where you look at the events of your life and you say, okay, if I were going to be hit by a truck tomorrow, what would be the most important thing on this list that someone should know about my life? And this may be something that, you know, you may have decided, for instance, that you're going to write just a short book about some childhood memories. And maybe the most important, most earth-shattering thing in your life happened later on in your life. That's okay. You can put that aside and you'll want to write about that someday, even if it doesn't take place in the scope, the smaller scope of this project that you're doing right now. But just for you to be able to identify, to go through your timeline and start circling things that you say, okay, this has got to be in my story, whether it's a story you're doing now or whether it's a story you're going to do later. But really start thinking about, what are the most important things that I want someone to know about me? And some of these things are just going to be sort of random. They could be descriptions of, you know, maybe what your father looked like while he was shaving, or you know, they don't have to be full-blown story ideas, but there are some certain things in here that you are going to want to, you're really going to want to make sure that don't get left out. So you start with what's the most important thing, and then what's the next most important thing, and you just kind of go through that and start circling things on your timeline. Okay, the next thing is you are going to spend some time thinking about what of these things that you've circled you want to start writing about and that you want to include in your story. We've talked for the last several webinars about the idea of, at the very beginning of your project, the first thing that you want to do is to think about, what is my purpose for writing my life story, or writing this particular story, or this particular group of stories? What do I hope to accomplish by this? What what do I hope that the reader will get out of it? And also think about who your audience is. Who is likely to be reading your story? Who is, are you writing it for your children? Are you writing it for your great-great-grandchildren that haven't been born yet? And maybe you don't know these things exactly when you start, and that's okay too. Or you can write something down, and you may change your mind later on as you get into the project and realize, that you kind of maybe have a different purpose than you thought you did. And it's okay to change your mind as you go along. But I think giving some thought to what your purpose is, what your audience is, and what is the scope of this particular project that you want to do. We are trying to encourage people to do smaller books and smaller stories at this time, and maybe do a series of volumes rather than trying to put everything in your whole life into one big volume, because that will make it easier for you in a lot of ways, and it will make it easier on your reader. I think most people would rather read a book that's 100 or 200 pages than something that's 500 or 600 or 700 pages. So it's just something to think about there. But give some thought to that, and that will help guide your efforts as you go along and help you decide what stories are most important to tell in this project. Okay, some other things to think about as you're trying to determine, which stories you might want to flesh out for your book. If you knew you would die tomorrow, what would be the most important thing you would want people to know about me? That's definitely something that, that you may want to start with. Does this story that I'm thinking about including, does it have a point? Why is it important enough to include? One thing that, we talked a lot yesterday, or last week rather, about what is a story and why a story should have a point to it, getting to the deeper meaning of a story rather than just giving reminiscences and anecdotes. And I just want to kind of say that not everything that goes in your book has to be a complete story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. I've read some perfectly charming books that are kind of what Tom likes to call a patchwork of memory, or a collection of reminiscences about a time period in your life. But I think if you just have a grouping of sort of short reminiscences that each one is sort of independent and they don't really go anywhere, it can get a little boring for your reader. But if you intersperse those with actual stories that do have a struggle, that have a conflict of some kind, and show how you came out of that struggle or how you solved this problem, that at least you have some of your book is that way, and you can intersperse it with other kinds of reminiscences. That will make your book more interesting as well. So not everything in your book has to be a complete story, but it does help, and it does make it more interesting. And then another thing you can do is ask your audience. If you're writing a book that you know that your children will want to read, maybe ask them, what would you like to know about my life? What about, what time period or what things would you like to know about me? And you might be surprised as to the answers that you get. Of course, you may be writing for an audience that isn't even born yet, and that's great. But maybe you can even project yourself kind of into the future and say, what would a child 100 years from now, what would they think would be interesting about my life and the way that I live now. You can also look at other elements that you find on your timeline that aren't really complete stories and kind of see how they connect together or how they might be combined into a single story. I told a little story last week about an incident that happened to me when I was in a junior high school play and lost part of my costume when my skirt fell off in front of the junior high school. And I won't tell that story again, but I realized as I was going over my timeline and looking at some of these things that this little story that I had always told as a funny anecdote, when I looked at some other things on my timeline about some of the kids at the junior high had been bullying me and what else was going on at the time, I realized that those elements were really connected and that I found a much deeper meaning in the story and that story and what came out of it and how I overcame that situation was really a turning point in my life. And I didn't even really realize that until I started to go through this process and write about that story. So that's something, looking at these things and how they connect to each other on your timeline and maybe finding other elements that were happening at the same time that might create a deeper meaning. Might bring some additional depth to your story. So take a look at that and see what kind of connections you can find there. And also there might just be a lot of sort of random details on your timeline that, you know, that are important to include, but they're not really a story in and of themselves. So you may want to look at some of those things and say, okay, how could I take this detail that I want to include somewhere and weave it into a larger story? So that detail gets included, but it's not just, you know, you're not just sort of reciting a random collection of details about where you were born or where you lived, or, you know, that it actually becomes a part of a larger story. Okay, now we're getting to the part where everybody sort of gets a little intimidated by. So we want to give you a few little tips here to make the whole process just a little less scary. And if there's one thing that I want you to come away with from this webinar today, it would be for you to not start at the beginning or at the chronological beginning of your life or at the chronological beginning of your story, because this is something that we have seen over and over, where we have clients that have come to us wanting some help in putting together a history book or a life story book. And what they've done is they have sat down and they've tried to start writing, and they start with their birth, or even what's even harder is they start with their ancestors. Okay, this is, they start writing about their grandparents and their parents' stories, and then they get up to their birth. And they start trying to write these stories, and with maybe a rough outline, maybe not, maybe they just start in and start trying to write the story, and then they're sort of editing it as they go along. And usually they get through about a chapter and a half, and they get stuck. They get burned out really easily. And that's because if you start at the chronological beginning of your life, you're starting with the place that's probably maybe the most difficult time for you to write about. Simply because you weren't actually there, or if you were too young to remember it. So it requires more research, it requires more thought and more kind of trying to dig for details to make it interesting when it's something that you don't have personal first-hand knowledge of. So sometimes if people start there, they're starting at the hardest place, and then they get burned out really quickly. So our advice is, and we find this works for just about any kind of project, whether you're working on a project for yourself or whether you're maybe writing a history about an ancestor or about your parents, or doing a book on someone else, is to start in a place that seems like the most fun to write about. Either it's the easiest story to tell, or it's maybe it's the most fun, or it's the most compelling. It's the one that's just bugging you the most, saying, write me, okay? Another thing that I want to mention too is that if you are intimidated by the idea of writing something, you don't necessarily have to write it. And this is what we do with probably at least half of our clients who have not written anything on their own. They know that they want to do something, but they're just not sure what to do or how to go about it. So we have a process where we will go and do a series of oral interviews with the client, and then take a written transcript of their interview and actually clean that up, edit it a little bit, and fashion that into the narrative of their book. So it becomes a nice first-person narrative. They always turn out really well because the person is just being themselves, and they're speaking the way that they normally speak, and the writing comes across as being really just fresh and very honest because they're just speaking. So that's something that even if you're writing it yourself, you want to sort of aim for having it be fresh and natural and actually sound like you. You want to make sure that the people who are reading it are going to be able to capture your voice and be able to even hear what you sound like. So if writing isn't your thing and it's intimidating to you, you can just tell your stories either to another person, or you can even just sit with a recorder in a room by yourself, and you can start telling your stories as well. And then you can transcribe those and use that as the narrative of your book. So both work quite well. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice a little bit today. So the next step, after you've created your timeline, you've got a lot of good things on your timeline, and you've circled a bunch of things that you say, okay, I think these might be some ideas for some stories. So the next thing is to create what we call story note cards. We have, for those of you who have our kit, we have a stack of the story note cards in the kit for you to write this on. If you don't have it, you can just use a notebook or paper, or index cards work really well. And basically what you want to do on a story note card is you want to kind of, jot some kind of a working title on the top so you know sort of which story it is that you're wanting to tell. Pick something, and you can do the story note cards in random order as well. Just pick the first one that jumps out at you off of your timeline. See if there's maybe other things that you circled on your timeline that might go along with that. And then just start jotting down everything that you can remember about that event, or details that you might want to add to that story, how you felt about it, how other people reacted at the time, and just start taking notes. And you're not writing the story yet. You're not trying to make it into a narrative. You're just jotting down as much as you can remember about that particular story. And if at this point you can determine what the point of the story is, then go ahead and put that also at the top of the card. And sometimes the point of the story isn't really evident to you until you've sort of collected all the details about it, and then you can maybe see a theme that emerges, or see maybe, oh yeah, here's what the struggle was in this particular situation. In this particular instance, when I was writing this story about the junior high play, I started writing some other things about my experiences in doing drama in high school, and about how that sort of changed my personality and the things that it gave me from doing that. And so I started sort of finding these connections of other things in my timeline, how it helped me get over my shyness, how it helped me get over being bullied at school, and those kind of things. So I was able to pull these different details from different areas of my timeline and put them together and put them all on my story note card. I would suggest that before you actually start trying to write any of the stories, that you go ahead and take everything that you've circled on your timeline, and you sit down and you just write a story note card for each one, rather than writing a story note card and then trying to write that story, so that by the time you finish this process, you'll just have a little stack of these cards or pieces of paper or whatever you're using. And and then you'll have this nice little stack that you can then start writing your stories from. So, and if this story feels so compelling to you that you just have to sit down and write it right now, or you have to sit down and tell this story while it's on your mind, you can do that as well. But generally, it seems to work better if you fill out a bunch of these story note cards and kind of have a stack of those before you actually start doing any writing. Okay. So when you're in the process of filling out your story note card, these are some questions that you can ask yourself to sort of get to that, is there a point to this story? Is there a deeper meaning than just a little reminiscence of a time in my life? First of all, you can, is it a humorous story or an entertaining story? And sometimes that's enough of a good reason to tell a story. I mean, we all love, sitting around at Thanksgiving and, your Uncle Jack tells, this story about how he got lost at the circus, and it's hilarious, and everybody always loves to hear it again every year. And so if you have some stories like that that are just like so funny or so entertaining that you just have to tell that story, sometimes it doesn't need to have, this big epic struggle. But going again back to Tom Sawyer, that struggle is partly what creates the drama and the tension in the story, even in a humorous story. So you can still look for those elements. Does this story reveal characters? Does it reveal something about someone's personality, either your own, or the protagonist of the story, or it could be, does it reveal the character of of your mom or your dad or your brother or your pet, or does it say something about shed light on the personality or character of any of the characters in your story? Does it teach a lesson of some sort? What did you learn from this situation, or what did someone else learn from the situation? What did you learn? How did you change? Did this event change you in some way? Did it make you a better person? Did it make you a different person? Did it change your situation that then sent your life on a whole different trajectory? Any of those kind of things can really add and make for a really good story. The point of your story also, just keep this in mind more as you're writing your stories. The point of the story can be self-evident, and usually in a good story it is. You don't have to, end each story with, and the moral of the story is, it will usually be evident unto itself without you having to hit the person over the head with it. Okay, so you have this little stack of story note cards, and you've sort of brainstormed a lot, and you've got all these details written down, and you feel like, okay, I am ready to start. I'm going to write my first story. So the first thing you need to do is to just somehow find a way to just turn off all those little voices in your head, because I have this little girl on the screen here who, and I'm sure most of you, if you've tried to write anything or tried to do anything, I mean, this kind of negative self-talk happens to a lot of us, and it could be when we have to get up and speak in public, when we are going to sing a song in front of people. Anything that you do that is worthwhile, you're going to have these little voices in your head that say, okay, are you sure you can handle this? Are you really good enough to be able to do this? And I know those voices come out in force whenever you are trying to sit down and write something. And maybe it's you had a really tough high school English teacher who's going to just rip apart your grammar. You want to get her out of your head, because you are writing this, at least this first draft, you are writing this just for you. No one else is going to read it. And you are just getting the stuff down on paper. You can always fix it later. You can edit out things later that might be sensitive or that might hurt other people's feelings. If you want to put it down on paper, you go ahead and you get it down on paper, and you can always change it, tone it down, improve it, make it better. And we will talk next in subsequent webinars about the editing process as well. But for right now, you're just trying to get get the stuff out of you on paper and just remember everything that you can. So just, don't worry about what your mother would think about, as she read it. Don't worry at this point about, grammar, spelling, any of that kind of stuff. You're just getting it out on paper. And the other most important takeaway today that I want you to remember when you're writing your story, aside from not starting with, at the chronological beginning of your life, is to not go back and edit or rework your first story when you've written it. So you're going to look at your timeline or get your stack of story note cards, and you're going to say, okay, which one of these is going to be the most fun to start writing? Okay, pick up that card and, look over your notes to get them in your head and just start writing that story. And just, if you can imagine, maybe you're just telling the story to someone as you're writing it, or you're writing it for yourself. And don't worry about, formulas or anything like that. Just kind of get the story down. And then once you've finished writing that story, just put it aside. Don't look at it again for a while and just move on to the next story. Don't go back and try to rework and perfect that story after you've written it, for two reasons. First of all, you could get stuck on that one story. And if you're sort of an obsessive perfectionist type person anyway, that, and we've seen this happen a lot with people where they want to get this one thing perfect before they move on to the next, and you could, stay there for months and never move forward. The other reason is that it will give you some perspective. If you put something aside for a while after you've written it, and then come back to it, a day later or a couple of weeks later or even a couple of months later, even a year later, if you give it some time and then come back to it, you will have a fresh perspective on what that sounds like. And will give you some insight into maybe some problems, or did you leave something out? Is it confusing? Those kind of things. So, so just write the first story, set it aside, and then go on to the next story. Another thing to think about as you're writing your story, some things to maybe make your stories a little more interesting and make them a little more intriguing, is look for the intrigue in the story. Look for any time that you can, and this is something that you will even maybe perfect a little further in the editing process, but if you have it, at least have it in your head while you're writing even the first draft of the story. Just look for how are you going to create suspense in your story and leave them wondering, what happens next. In my story where I was standing on the stage with my skirt down around my ankles in this play, the reader should be wondering, what's she going to do now? So keep that in mind, and also look for the emotion in the story. We talked about this before, whether it's a struggle but how did you feel? Rather than just saying, okay, here's what happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. How did you feel about it? How did the other people in your story feel about what was going on? That adding that emotion or making sure that that's in there and that you're not just reciting a series of anecdotes is going to make your story more compelling. In this particular story, I started out in a place of humiliation and moved towards a place of triumph. I was able to triumph over this little tragic event in the life of a junior high school girl, and and that made a change in my life. So look for those sort of turning points. What point did you start at the beginning of the story, and where did you end up, and how did that happen? How did that happen in between? One thing to keep in mind too as you're writing your stories is the more specific you get with the way that you tell the story, the more you can create a picture in the reader's head so they can actually see what's going on in the story and get their own mental picture of your story rather than just reading words on the page. This is just an example on the screen here. And where to tell the story, and this is just a little detail, my father was very frugal. And this might be an example of something that you would have written on your timeline or in your story notes, where you just say, my dad was a very frugal person. So how are you going to show the reader that your dad was frugal, other than just saying he was frugal? You know, you can take my word for it. You can actually create a picture in their mind. My father kept every rubber band that came into the house in an old coffee can. He washed and reused aluminum foil, carefully folded up each square and tucked it away in the special drawer that he kept just for aluminum foil. So that creates a picture in the reader's mind to show really what that looked like, you know, because frugal people are all frugal in their own ways. Make sure that when you include detail, and detail I think is always good, and being specific in creating that picture for the reader. But it's also important to make sure that you include the right kind of detail, and that you're including interesting details and not details that are irrelevant or might be boring to your reader. Roy Peter Clark is he's a writer and writing coach and author who, if you're looking for some books that really go into detail on how to write better, I would highly recommend reading any of Roy Peter Clark's books. He wrote one called, I'm looking up at my bookshelf here right now, there's one called Writing Tools, which is great. He wrote one on grammar called The Glamour of Grammar, which is, you know, if you want to improve your grammar and figure out those kind of things, that's a good one to read. There's also another excellent book that we liked called, let's see what that one is. Oh yeah, and he also wrote one called Help for Writers. There's another really great book that I would suggest while I'm on the topic by William Zinsser called On Writing Well, and that's also a really excellent book. And none of these are really long, big textbook type books. They're all very readable and just give you a lot of really helpful tips on how to write better in general, whether you're writing a story or writing a business letter. But Roy Peter Clark said the report points us there, the story puts us there. So rather than giving a report of what happened, we want to actually create a visual picture for them to look at. And I've included an example here, and this is actually an example from two different books that people brought to, two writing samples of two different people that we worked with. The first one is a good example of relevant detail. It tells detail about this person's childhood home, and you really get a picture of what the house looked like and what it meant to its occupants. We relished the spaciousness of our new home, an attractive two-story brick house with shutters and a white-trimmed porch. Shaded by fragrant linden trees, it faced a small concrete cul-de-sac, which quickly became a private speedway for our tricycles and doll buggies. Mother could observe our activities from her second-story sewing room, throwing open the dormer window that in later years became Juliet's balcony and the deck of the Pequod. Okay, so that's a really good example of how you can actually see the trees. You can see Mother leaning out of the window, and you can see these kids pretending to be Juliet or pretending to be Captain Ahab, on this balcony of the house. So you get this beautiful mental picture, and it tells you what the house looked like and such. The second example here basically gives you all the data, but none of it's particularly interesting. In 1995, we moved into a new house in Shady Brook. The asking price was $125,000, but we were able to get it for $123,500. It took the movers 3 days to pack our belongings, 250 boxes total. The house had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and an unfinished basement. The second-story bathroom needed a lot of work, so we spent about $5,000 to remodel it. So that is an example of, and I'm not saying that all of this stuff is not interesting or not important to include, because I think, for someone 100 years from now or 50 years from now, knowing what you paid for your house might be really interesting to them, especially, that's when we read someone's account of, 50 years ago of how much gas, that they paid, 15 cents a gallon for gas. I mean, that's an interesting detail to us. So I'm not saying that detail is completely irrelevant or might not be interesting, but if you can weave it into a larger story and include other more emotional details as well, it's going to be much more interesting. Tina's asking a question. Could you tell us the author of On Writing Well again? Let's see. On Writing Well is, I'm sorry, William Zinsser, Z-I-N-S-S-E-R. And that's a great book. I would highly recommend it. Okay, just some other things to keep in mind as you are writing. One thing is to use active voice versus passive voice, and this is something, if you took any kind of writing in school, you probably had a professor that pounded this into your head. But it is something that a lot of people who haven't studied writing are not really aware of the fact that they do this. But here's just a quick example. Passive voice would be, the entire pie was eaten by my sister. Whereas active, my sister ate the whole pie. So the idea is that you have, whatever you're saying, that you have people, like the person is doing the action rather than the pie is being acted upon by your sister. It's your sister that's actually eating the pie. It's kind of a fine distinction, but it will make your writing much more direct and easier to read. Also, read your stories out loud to yourself, and this is something we'll talk about a lot more in the editing process. You may not even want to do this when you're writing your first draft, but sometimes if you read something aloud to yourself, you can hear things that you won't necessarily get when you're just reading it on the page. So, and sometimes I've found this myself where I'll be writing something and I read it out loud and it sounds a little bit sing-songy, and I think, well, that's because every sentence is kind of the same length. So if you maybe have some shorter sentences and some longer sentences, and you sort of get out of that just pattern of having everything sort of be the same, that can help your writing a great deal. Okay, so essentially just to review, this is the method that has worked for us and that has worked for a lot of people. That basically you find that low-hanging story, you find that first story and start, that will be the most fun or the easiest to write, and start there. You write it, don't edit, don't criticize yourself, don't try to go back and rework it, just write it, get it down on paper, put it aside. And then you just keep doing that through your whole stack of story note cards until you have this stack of paper, or stack of documents in your computer, however you want to do it. It's totally up to you. And that's something that I didn't really mention before, but I think write in a way that you are the most comfortable with. And it doesn't matter if you want to write in pencil on a stack of legal pads, that is perfectly fine. If you want to record your story into a recorder or use Dragon, naturally speaking, Dragon Dictation, which is a speech recognition software that will automatically transcribe your speech as you're talking, you can use something like that. If you want to type it on your computer, if you want to type it with 2 thumbs on your smartphone, whatever works for you is great. Whatever you're comfortable with is going to make it easier for you. So just keep going through this process, and then you'll have a stack of stories. Your next step, which we'll talk about, I believe, in the next webinar, is to then sit down with your stack of stories and find an order. Find an order that makes sense to put them in. Because we're so adamant about not writing your stories in chronological order, then you'll want to take this sort of random collection of stories and then figure out how will these best fit together. Maybe you'll have a thematic history where you'll have the story is told by a series of themes, and it doesn't necessarily have to follow a chronological narrative, but it certainly can too. It's writing a chronological story is certainly a legitimate way to write your story, but it doesn't have to be. You can use flashbacks. You can start with a dramatic incident and then go backward in time to, go up to tell the rest of the story up to that dramatic incident. There's a number of ways to do that, and we will talk about that more in the next webinar. And then you'll write some bridges or transitions between those stories if they sort of jump around and and need some softening to put them together, that's something that you'll also do in the editing process. But basically, following that process, you will be surprised at how easy, not that it won't take time and effort, but how you can actually get a first draft of your whole story by following that, that method and just doing it in little bits and pieces at a time in a random order, as opposed to trying to start at the beginning and then go all the way through to the end. Doing it this sort of in random order will make it so much easier for you, I promise. I think last thing I just want to leave you with is Isak Dinesen, who wrote Out of Africa, if anybody's read that book. She says, to be a person is to have a story to tell. And I just want to encourage all of you that everyone has a story to tell. Everybody has interesting things that have happened in their lives. And this process will help you find what's interesting about your life. And it can be really fun, and you will learn a lot about yourself by doing this. Next week, we'll talk about the editing process and talk about finding theme and order, I think is a couple of weeks after that. And if any of you are, if you're interested in checking out our How to Save Your Life kit, basically this takes our whole method that we use with our clients that we work with all the time, and we've put it into a do-it-yourself book and kit that kind of takes you through all of these steps with exercises and so forth. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our website and check it out. And if anybody's interested in purchasing the kit and you want to get a discount code, you can email us and we will be happy to give you that code. And I'm going to open it up now. I'm going to put my email address on here. If I can type it correctly. And then I'm just going to open up the time, and if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type them in. I would, for some reason, my microphone works, but my speakers are not working on my computer this morning. So if you try to say anything, I won't be able to hear you. So go ahead and just type something in the chat window if you have a question. And Tom's here with me, and I haven't let him get a word in edgewise the whole time. So was there anything that you wanted to add about anything we've been talking about while we're seeing if anyone has any questions?
Well, better yet, when I'm quiet, that's when I'm at my best. You know, I hope each of you are thinking about your own stories. And if you get to this point and it may seem frustrating or that I'm not a writer or whatever, I hope some of these tools will help. And we've given a couple books that are really excellent, but also the key is to get going. And you can learn as you go, but to do something, and to do something on your own stories. And if you get to this point thinking, I don't have anything to write, go back to some of the initial parts of really the power in the timeline and gathering your own ideas, and then do something today. Think of maybe a couple details or points of your own stories. And the best stories are those that are as you tell them. You really are a good storyteller. You just may not realize that at this point. But having talked with some of you, and I know that there are some great storytellers there, but you really all have that in you if you just be yourself, if you're natural, and if you don't feel like writing to start with, tell it into a recorder. But begin to record and get some of those stories down.
Anything else? Okay, I'm just typing in the names of those, the books and the authors that we were recommending earlier.
You know, one thing I do want to add here that I've actually been working on this past week is I think we each have our timelines where we can find many stories, tens or even hundreds of stories or incidents or things about our life that may be worth sharing or interesting. But also in looking at some of those other people that you could help tell their stories. I'm right now working on just some small parts of my father's life and that of my mother. And you know, even those can get quite expansive. But I've just thought, well, this next little piece, and again, my one chapter at a time, I'm taking what were they doing during World War II? They'd not yet met, and my father went and joined the Navy, actually, when he was old enough. He'd been working at a aircraft plant, and then he lied about his age. And then when he turned 18, he joined the Navy and got in and became a fighter pilot, actually. My mother was a cadet nurse. So think about some of the stories of those that are important to you, that their stories ought to be preserved, that they may need some help telling. How you can compile those and put those together. So it's your stories, but also others.
If Tom's done with his story, I'm going to interrupt at the question. We had a question here from Diana, who says, if I tell my own story to a tape recorder, is there a good transcription tool available for the mini cassettes we use today? And somebody else suggested Dragon 12. Tom, do you want to address that? I know you've had some experience with using a pre-recorded, trying to take a pre-recorded file and then have Dragon listen to it, and it didn't work out terribly well if it's not put into Dragon in the first place. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think one of the best things here is to experiment and find what works for you. I have used Dragon successfully where I've talked directly into that, and even where I've taken a version of Dragon that's set to take recorded recordings and turn them into transcriptions that is kind of configured for that. Whereas I took a recording that was not really set up that way, where I recorded in a different environment that may have had some different acoustics and situation, and said, well, now Dragon, deal with this. And it was maybe 85–90% accurate, which is really horrible when you get into it, because Dragon now claims that it's 99.9%, which is great. And Dragon is really a great tool, but you need to get some pretty high accuracy to really make it work for you. Otherwise, just start and stop the recording and type it as you go.
You can also get someone else to do the transcription for you. You might even look for a local college student, or get, hire your grandkids to do it or something. That's also a possibility, is to get someone else to help you with the transcription. There's a question from Susan that I want to address. She says, what's a good program to write these stories and include pictures? I've been using Word, and as I add pictures, it messes up the format and everything moves, even when I try to freeze the pictures in place. Okay, that is, again, that's a pretty complicated one, and we will talk about that in a lot more detail as we in steps 8 and 9, which will be in April sometime as we're talking about this process. But just to give you a heads up right now, we don't recommend Word for trying to add pictures, or any word processing program for that matter, in trying to incorporate pictures in with your text. And we'll talk about some other programs that you can use for that, or other ways to do it. But one thing I want to stress at this point is, when you're writing your stories, Word is a great program for doing any kind of writing in text, but just until you have gone through your entire editing process, proofreading, everything, don't even start to think about putting your pictures in with the stories until your text is completely done, because otherwise that will make it a lot easier for you if you have your text completely done and you have your pictures all scanned and ready to go, and then you put them together as the last your last step, rather than trying to put in your pictures as you go along, because that can just be a nightmare, especially if you're trying to add pictures into a word processing program. But we will address that in a lot more detail later on down the line. There's also a lot of information in our book about this. Diana says, I'm a genealogist with many old letters, etc., handed down from ancestors. Hope you'll do a webinar helping us use old documents. Yes, we will definitely talk about that, and that's something that is, we feel is really important to include, is, handwriting and that kind of thing. I did a genealogical storybook essentially on my grandfather's family, where I included a lot of that kind of stuff with the narrative. So there's a lot of really creative ways that you can use those, and we will talk about that. There's also, if you go to our picturesandstories.com website and look at our blog. I've written some articles about, you know, some of those topics as well. So you can follow our blogging and get those articles that talk about that. Joan says, what version of Dragon is there for recorded material?
It's going to depend whether you use a Windows computer or a Mac, and simply go to their website. I think it's Nuance, but you can just type in Google or search on Dragon, naturally speaking, and find their website and find one that really matches up to your particular operating system.
Okay, we've got just a few minutes left. Susan asks, will you be teaching at the South Davis Family History Fair again? And if so, what will you cover? Yes, Susan, we will be there. And I'm trying to remember off the we're scratching our heads right now going, okay, now which ones are we doing at South Davis? We're also teaching this Saturday at the Riverton Family History Center. We're each teaching a class there this Saturday as well. But we're doing some on pictures and on stories. I think the two that I'm doing at South Davis will be about pictures, organizing your digital photos, and also how to choose what pictures to use in with your stories.
And at South Davis, I will be teaching how to interview yourself, which is some of the things I talked about at Roots Tech. So that'll be at South Davis. That's the end of April. Again, we mentioned at the Riverton Family History Center this Saturday, that's this weekend, I'll be teaching how to save your life one chapter at a time.
And then I will also be talking about stories and how to choose some of this story triage that we talked about, and choosing stories and what stories to tell, and some tips on writing. So a lot of what we've covered in the last couple of weeks, I'll be also teaching this Saturday at Riverton. Got a couple more minutes. Anybody have any last questions? I think we're okay. If nobody has any final questions, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate your time, and we hope that it's been useful for you and that you have learned something. And we would also say that if you would like to, if you have any questions that you want to ask us, you can also email us, either tom@picturesandstories.com or Allison with 1L at picturesandstories.com. And do check out our website. You can invite your friends and look at our blogs. There's a lot of good content on there as well. So thank you so much, and we hope you all have a great day.